Hello, one and all. Welcome to the afternoon session of our fall symposium. For those of you who have arrived to our show already in progress, I would like to remind you to turn off your cell phones, and that we have shuffled the personnel. So if you're looking at your schedule, Larry Norris, who was going to go earlier this morning, changed places with Indigo, who has already presented. So we will be hearing from Larry now. Larry is the founder of ERIE and one of our core members, an indefatigable worker. We all appreciate his efforts. And in addition to being a doctoral student in East-West psychology, he is also an artist. And so the intersection of his artistic endeavors with his explorations into entheogens, particularly ayahuasca, is going to be the subject of his talk today. I'd like you to all welcome Larry Norris.
Hello, everyone. So the first part about talking is always getting over the microphone backfeed of hearing your own voice through your ears, right? So my name is Larry. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This is really great to see so many people here. Some of you have seen at our April conference we had, and we're going to continue doing this project. Adrian mentioned earlier that what ERIE represents are 3 different points. He talked about the educational point earlier, which is kind of what we're doing here, giving a platform for these conversations. But a little bit of what I'm going to be talking about today, besides the intersection of art and my journey space, is that this is actually, I'm using this a lot for the integration aspect. So when you're coming across these really ineffable, strange, unusual experiences, how do I bring them back to ground and sort of look at them in this reality? And that's the second point of ERIE's mission statement, the integration. So we actually have integration circles that happen about twice a month. It's just a pure circle that we can all sit around and have a conversation with each other, share the experiences, have some time for reflection. It seems to be awesome. I really love it. It's really great to share, and it seems like everyone else is enjoying it as well. This here is going to be a little bit more about integration on a personal sense. How can you work with integration at home? How can you work with these experiences as well? It does say founder, but I must say that I've had a lot of help from all of my EWP, PCC, and ICP friends, including Jordan and Adrian and Tati and Veronica and Anna and Krista, et cetera, et cetera. On the bottom there, that's my artist name, Lava Larry. So actually on all these pillars here are my artwork. So these are the pieces I'll be talking about as I reflect through this presentation. Those of you who might have better viewing spots than others, but you can always check them out a little later on. What's interesting with my work is that I've always kind of been interested in art. I've always used it as a way to sort of create, but I've never really focused on it as a way to sort of ground material. And I really started doing this once I started working with ayahuasca. So although I worked with a lot of other substances, mushrooms, LSD, MDMA, 2CI, 2CB, etc., ayahuasca was really the one that helped provoke this creative need for myself. And there's actually an interesting study out of Hungary done by somebody by the name of Eddie Fresca, and he's looked at ayahuasca in relationship to creativity. He's found that, we probably all know this already, but that the testing shows that there's an increased openness and an increased flexibility after working with ayahuasca towards creativity. So you're more able to sort of look into the imagery, see imagery, pull things out, enjoy the subtle nuances of what's there. So I started working with the ayahuasca maybe in 2000, and I started working on paintings and imagery about 2001. What I started with are the black and whites on this post here, which you can't see right now, but I'll talk about them a little later. And these were done with a carving with a knife, and everything else since then. Since I started actually at CIIS, I've been working with paintings, which is also interesting. As I sort of ground the material in academic sense, I'm able to work more with colors and more with brighter imagery. So to start off, most recently I just was doing a research project in Brazil, and my focus of the research project was on visual states. There are many different types of visual states. Benny Shannon, I don't know if you've heard of him, but he wrote a fantastic book called Antiquities of the Mind, Charting the Phenomenology of the Ayahuasca Experience. And these are just a couple of the different types of visions that he talks about in his research. You know, you have your bursts, your puffs, your splashes, your sort of like, nothing's really, it's just like kind of flashing of lights, things like that. Your typical kaleidoscope where you have that imagery like a mandala almost, you can find little sections to go into. Snapshots are like still images that come through. Glimpses are there and gone really quickly. All those are one kind of area of vision. The next part here, this full-fledged scene, and I kind of touched on this a little bit in my talk in April. Full-fledged scene is a whole nother level of vision. So the two types of full-fledged scenes are the grand and the virtual reality scenes. So the grand scenes are like watching a movie. You're in like a cinematic sort of scene, and you're also able to view, but you feel involved, but you're a little bit distant. You're able to make that separation. The virtual reality scene is not that way at all, actually. The virtual reality scene, you're totally immersed in it. Frank was talking earlier about dismemberment. This is often what happens in this virtual reality type scene. There's some sort of active interaction, as he would call it, with the space itself. Those are the most interesting to me because those are the scenes that when you're there, this hyper-reality state happens. You know, there's nothing else but that experience. But I was actually doing some research on my art and relationship to visions, and I came across this work by Henrik Kluver, who actually in 1928 produced this work on mescaline. He talks about an image called a presque vu image, or he calls it an almost seen image. And this is sort of, maybe some people have had this experience before, where you're sort of, these two images are morphing together. And this sort of in-between state, this tantric, not this state, creates this unusual feeling. And he calls this like being on the brink of epiphany, or like something's right on the tip of your tongue. And this actually comes through images. So I play with these types of images as well as the grand scene and virtual reality scenes. So as we're talking about this, you know, the terminology to use to relate to these paintings in sort of an imaginatory way, you know, that would be a Jungian concept, active imagination. So there's two different ways that I employ this active imagination. One of them I call sort of entheogenic photography. And maybe this is a bad term, but basically what it is I'm trying to represent a place that I saw. I saw an interesting talk by Alex Gray on Bicycle Day, April 19th. And he was talking about how visionary artists nowadays are not really so much creating anymore as they are representing places that they've seen. This is really interesting from a psychological point of view, because is it possible, if art is an alternative way of knowing, can we sort of link together these paintings and create some sort of the map of the other, if you will? So this is why I really, I think myself and others work with this, what I call entheogenic photography, trying to take a picture of a place, not necessarily a picture in purely a visual sense, but like adding all the different elements to it. For example, like, you know, the emotion state, or this presque vu state where it's in and out, or moving things and morphing things so people aren't really able to get a good sense of it. And the second one, this is an active imagination I work with in certain lenses as well, and this is more the presque vu. This is letting the image emerge and sort of beginning that dialogue. So rather than having an idea before you start your painting, actually to create sort of this chaotic mess of lines and paintbrush strokes, and then look what comes out of that, and then start to dialogue with those characters. This works really well for me as far as like if I'm trying to integrate an experience that I don't really have a space for, and then I had very interesting dialogues with these entities that I was talking about earlier. So I was reading some work by a man named Johnson, who's talking in his book Inner Work, Steps of Active Imagination. So these are maybe, are you hearing me? By the way, okay. So these are the 4 different steps of active imagination. The first one, of course, is sort of the invitation, sort of the asking, the intention, the building of this connection between the other and yourself. And it's sort of like just, hey, you know, I'm here, I'm ready to do this work, and what happens now. The second part is the dialogue part. This is where the actual dialogue begins. This is where the emerging of characters begin, that type of thing. The third part I'm not really too big of a fan of, but I think it's interesting. The reason that Johnson talks about ethical values is because sometimes active imagination, when you're in these places, it's really overwhelming. You know, your characters are telling you things that are pretty true and pretty on it, and sometimes they're not always in the positive light. So you have to be kind of prepared to get slapped around a little bit by whatever's there. He says to work with ethical values, so you can put this value system onto these experiences, so that if the entities or whoever it is that's having the dialogue with you crosses the line, you can say, hey, I've already made these boundaries. Jung would probably tell you this isn't a good idea. If anyone's read the Red Book, it's pretty intense, and there's a lot of different things going on where the characters are telling him that he doesn't know anything about anything. So to put these ethical values, I think, is kind of a human need or human want, but it doesn't really work when you're talking about other beings. And then the ritual is just to sort of make it concrete. So what are you going to do to make your integration, your active imagination concrete? It could be like a dance, could be a ceremony, a ritual, could be a painting, it could be writing, what have you. Johnson does talk about needing to use writing along this whole process. I personally just work with the art, so I don't really involve the writing so much, although I do write a little bit, but I think having this dialogue, this conversation, if you want to look at it later and you don't speak in a symbolic language, as many artists speak in symbolic languages, we can connect right with our paintings and go back to those spots. But sometimes it's good just to jot some things down as well. So what is the goal of this talk? Really, the goal of the talk is to talk about how are we going to work with these experiences. That's really sort of the crux of the conversation here. We've all had very strange and unusual experiences, and we sit there and we try and talk to our friends, and they're like, I don't understand what you're talking about. And you're trying to explain multidimensionality or paradoxes or that type of thing. It doesn't really help. But to connect to this archetypal energy, to connect to this old way of ourselves, our inner selves, and having this dialogue. In the shamanic context, it would be having dialogues with plant teacher. In the West, we don't really have a terminology for that. Maybe we call it archetypes, but I think there is something to be said about the wisdom of the plants. And just to begin to initiate that conversation, to invite that conversation to happen. And once you invite that conversation, it really helps. Maybe it doesn't help on a conscious level, but on a subconscious level, you're already starting to work that material, you're starting to move that energy. So this right here is to show you that even if you're not an artist, you can work with this type of material, which is really fantastic. This is how I started off on one of my paintings. I mean, it's just kind of a mess, but this is, I'll show you through a slideshow here, a slight little emergence of the imagery. And like I said, I've talked to a lot of friends of mine, and many people think that when you're an artist, one of the most challenging things is a blank canvas, because you have an infinite amount of opportunities to express whatever you want to express, and people just have trouble just starting it. What I've told a lot of my friends that have been working with painting is to not even worry about it, just create a mess, and then let's see what happens. You're really, from this perspective of an artist, you're looking at it as like, what am I seeing, not what am I painting? What am I seeing there, what am I carving out, and what am I pulling forth? So it's more about learning and teaching yourself how to see versus learning and teaching yourself how to paint. So let me just do a little. So this is going to be kind of fast, but it'll go through, and the painting here is on the other side of this. You see right now, still you can't really see, there's nothing really happening there. Maybe some emergence happens here. I also find that as the characters start to come out, they start to have deeper dialogue. They want to be worked on a little bit more. Sometimes they want more focus than other characters do. And just kind of let it evolve into what it is. Put some colors in, straighten some things out. Now the beautiful thing about paints is you can paint over things, you can cut lines out, you can carve, you can do all this type of work. It's not like the paintbrush stroke isn't your final answer. You're going to be able to work on it quite a bit. What's also interesting here, you see the character in the middle with the smiley and the frowny face. I noticed that as I adjusted there, adjusted the emotions on the smiling frowny face, how I had an interaction and dialogue with them changed as well. This painting here was more from an active imagination process here from a Jungian perspective. So I wasn't actually looking at it from a lens of entheogens. Later I'll show you another painting that I did similar to this, but I was doing active imagination under the lens of ayahuasca. And there's some similarities between the two paintings, but vast differences. So when I look at these side by side, it's kind of interesting to see, oh, here's this one painting here that's done without the entheogenic scope. Here's another painting done with the entheogenic scope, and somehow in my mind I'm able to make a distinction between the two spaces. Just fun to watch this little thing just kind of cruise through. Eyes come big and small, and things change, and tears come, and little other things. So. You know, like, this is great, you know, like, you don't really have to, like, show your work to anybody. You can just play with it, and that's really fun. And because it's fun, and because you're working with material that's really difficult to work with, you're really grounding it and working with it. So the next part, before I go into that too, like, one other thing about this too, which is important, is like, you know, as I'm working with this precipice state, this almost seen state, this brink of epiphany state, you have to be sort of aware of like emotions that come through, because the emotions can also be halfway in between two different places, and watch yourself, be aware of yourself as you're going through these. And this might be where Johnson was saying to jot some things down writing-wise so you can capture some of these emotional states. Another nice thing about working with art in relationship versus like writing is you can, and I was mentioning this earlier at lunch, you can actually imply things that maybe aren't there. So you can paint a house on stilts. You haven't really painted a flooded waterway, but you've shown that there is that possibility. Or you can have a night scene that's really bright and well lit, and maybe this is referring to the moonlight. So there's lots of things you can do in paintings which are a little bit different than words, or maybe you could do it in dance. I don't really work as well with dance as I do with paintings, but there's a lot of implications you can do with paintings. So I'm going to go a little bit more into my paintings now and my carvings. So this here, and as I go through the paintings and the carvings, I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about the experience itself that I had that sort of sparked this imagery, and also you know, what I'm doing here. So these are the scratchboard work. This is what I'm working with originally, this one and this one. So it's all black and white. I put a little bit of color in here and there. This one I call Purging Duality. I don't know if you can see it, but right here is kind of like this person throwing up, coming around here. I don't know if you can see it now, but this journey was actually initiated by my first taste or entrance or look at what possibly non-duality could be. And I don't feel like I've experienced it yet, but I've gone in that direction. So what happened is, over the course of, this is the 5th journey over the course of 2 weeks, after the course of this journey, I've really sort of spent some time and like really gotten rid of all the little things that I need to get rid of to purify to get to this next state. And finally, in this one journey, I started getting rid of everything, and I was like finding myself getting rid of my body and freeing and flowing and going up into this ether. And as I was in this ether, and almost to what I would have considered non-duality, it was like this river of black and white. That's all it was. It's just black and white river, and I was immersed in this black and white river. And what ended up happening was, you know, it was just I look at black and white as being the two contrast colors, not so much in the sense of dark and light, but as in the sense of like when you have, and that's another nice thing about these paintings, is when you have this black and white, your eyes will move more. It creates this undulation, this sort of your eyes need to focus on one or the other. Another person was talking at our April conference and talking about Alex Gray doing the same thing with reds and blues, and putting reds and blues next to each other, and your eyes are kind of constantly battling and moving and creating this undulation. So that happens here. But what ended up happening was, as I was getting further and further into these journeys, I started to strip everything away, and I got to this point of where I thought, okay, I can release into the nothingness, and then I all of a sudden came across this sensation of loneliness, which is such a strange sensation, because here we are, we're trying to connect with oneness, right? Being one with everything. And then there's the ultimate sense of, for me, there's this ultimate sense of like, well, who am I going to talk to when there's nobody else around? What about my family? What about my desires and my fears and all these other types of things? And I went through this whole journey about desires and fears and their relationship to us and how we need to work with them in order to get to the next stage. So I had this, I did write a nice little interesting paper about this, but about how fears, memories, and desires have a certain weight to them. And because fears and desires haven't been explored yet, there's a mystery to them. And that mystery has more weight than would a memory. So through this work here, I started realizing that maybe our goal in life is to explore our fears and to explore our desires and actually satiate that and find out what's there and get rid of the not get rid of the mystery, because I think mystery is a good thing too, but I think as we move on from this life to the next life, to get rid of sort of this weight and this attachment to the world. And by exploring what our desires are and what our fears are, it'll be easier, because once we turn them into memories, they have less weight to them and they're easy to move through. This next piece is called Amazon Medicine. Similar idea with the black and white scratch. This is probably Actually, this is actually a little before the one I showed you, but the same style. But this painting in particular was interesting because I did this while I was learning with Roberto Venosa and Martina Hoffman, and a couple of slides that Frank was showing were from their artwork. Martina and Roberto were known for doing what's called the Mish technique, which is a technique in, I think, a Danish Flemish painter was working with. So it's layers where you create a red, a yellow, and a blue layer, highlight each one, and then what's called an optical gray comes out of it. So you're seeing all three of those colors at the same time through the highlights. I was being stubborn and wanted to work on my pieces instead of learning the Mish technique from these great masters, right? So that's my thing, right? But what was really interesting is like I was still absorbing, still learning, and this piece came out of that. Through that work through those 2 weeks. And so I've always connected this piece because I think this is sort of my entrance into sort of the color and the painting world from this black and white world. So the first piece that I ever worked with from the Mish technique was this one here. This one's called Pele Breaks Free. Again, this was done with multiple highlighting. You have a red layer, a yellow layer, a blue layer, and then you put colors on top, but you can see the highlights in the legs. You can kind of see all those different colors. Excuse the PowerPoint for not being as gorgeous in colors as it should be. But this piece, this was sort of inspired by a journey I had in Maui with a girlfriend I had at the time. And I know this is a major taboo, but we decided that we were going to explore sexuality in relationship to the ayahuasca experience. And of course, most people know this is part of the diet, right? You're not supposed to have sex 3 or 4 days beforehand. You're supposed to really stay away from that kind of contact. But we were enjoying a common circle, so there was no real facilitator. It was just a bunch of friends that were coming together that have all explored. So we thought we'd explore in this way. It was a really, really powerful experience. Keep in mind that if you do work with this type of experience, you have to be prepared to see the demons of your partner and also have them be able to see your demons. You have to be really open to this. But the experience itself is gorgeous because what ended up happening was like she immediately went into a trance state, right? And I felt like, okay, I'm here to support her process right now. And so I felt like it's interesting. Also, Frank was talking about these lines that go through people. This is also a big part of the Shipibo cosmology. I had an entire journey about these lines and this knot and these energies that go through the body. And then the next day, I actually read the paper on the Shipibo. So the question is, did I catch that from my paper the previous day, or was I just connecting to this archetypal imagery of energy? So what ended up happening was I felt like I was the rudder on the back of a ship, and she was micromanaging her experiences. She was actually able to get into the memory itself and look at it from that perspective, see everyone's viewpoint. I was getting a more macro imagery to see where the knots were and to help her sort of along the way. So as she would untangle a knot, I would see this entanglement and help her move into the next knot area. After a period of time, she came back from her trance, and almost instantaneously I went into my trance, which was also a beautiful thing. What my experience was at this point was that she held me over top of me and grabbed my ankles, and her whole experience was holding the ankles like Achilles, you know. And for me, I was seeing her as the Egyptian Nut goddess, you know, with the stars and the moon and the belly. Really, really beautiful. But what ended up happening was by her holding this container for me, it allowed me to get much deeper into my experience. So as a male, I'm sure some of the males here can understand that there's this cultural thing about us crying for too long or having sorrow and that kind of thing. Having this container that she built for me by containing me through this holding, I was able to go, and it's hard to say, but there's a drawer in my leg, for lack of a better term, and I was able to open the drawer up, and it was just like years of sorrow, and I cried and cried and cried for probably, I mean, who knows how long it was, but I felt like I emptied out this drawer, and I probably would never have been able to empty out this drawer before if I wasn't able to work with her in this way. So something to think about, you know, I mean, there's obviously I don't recommend it necessarily because that's taboo, but at the same time there can be some fantastic things when you're working with somebody else in this manner, a touch kind of environment, opening and closing the ceremony by making love, and then keeping our contact through the whole time. The next painting I'm going to talk about, the Staff of Asclepius. This is actually owned by a fellow ERIE member, so sitting on the well and enjoying his place up there. So this whole imagery came to me because of the archetype of the snake, right? So here we are, we're having experiences of the snake. And coming from a Western culture, typically when you hear about the snake, it always has this sort of this evilness to it, or this darkness to it. Like the Christian and Catholic religion. You have the snake that's trying to seduce Adam and Eve into eating the fruit, and all these other snake archetypes from the West that aren't necessarily positive. What I found interesting, though, is that you see often, at least in the research I was working on recently, and also just from anecdotal evidence, that the snake is a symbol of healing and rejuvenation. So I started to think, why is it that I'm having the snake imagery, and my background of snake is always to look at it from this one perspective. So I kind of did a little work, and also through a friend of mine, she told a little bit about this Asclepius. So Asclepius is a healer from the Greek mythology. And typically Asclepius heals through, he's going to be healing through dream work. He has a spa. He works with a lot of herbs and that type of thing. So he's already kind of more on the shamanic level than would be like a purely medical doctor. But what ended up happening was one day a snake came into his spa, and he didn't want the snake there, so he ended up like killing it with his staff. Later on, he found that another snake came in and put some herbs in the snake's mouth to revive the snake. So I don't know if you are familiar, but this is actually the medical symbol, right? We have is well, there's a whole story about this too, but actually our staff of Asclepius is our medical symbol. There's also the codices of Hermes. I wrote a paper on this one as well, which is that this is actually used more from a healing perspective, and the codices of Hermes used in the medical situation is used more in business, which is interesting. And that was actually in 1905 was changed over by an army military general from this original staff of healing to the Hermes codices. So there's a whole history about that as well. And if you look at how symbols interact with us on a daily basis, it's kind of interesting to see that mythology come about. So the next painting I will show you, called Cosmic Web Portal number 5, which it's just one way to talk about it, I guess. So this journey was really, really fascinating for me. This journey here I had last year, but this is a journey that I've had over the course of time. It's a journey I keep asking, like, to understand or to appreciate or to get into the idea of weaving. If a fabric is made, or if the universe is made of fabric, is it possible to weave, to pull apart the fabric, to move beyond space, get through the veil, that type of thing? So in this journey right here, before the journey, my intention was to meet my ancestors and to learn more about weaving. And all of a sudden, here I am in the spider's den. And I was like, where are my ancestors? This is kind of weird, right? Like, I don't know, am I connected to a spider in some way? And I came to realize that the more important lesson to be learned, and of course, who knows, maybe, insects have been around for much longer than we have, so I guess we're connected in some way, right? But this whole experience was about weaving. What was interesting about this weaving experience is here I am, I see this spider on the outskirts of my vision. And so automatically I'm like, oh, there's a teacher there. I'd love to learn the lessons of the teacher. How can I get in contact with this teacher? But the teacher was being really coy and kind of like staying away, not really like paying attention to me. So I'm like, well, how am I going to talk about, or how am I going to get this teacher's attention? And this is also one of the things as people who I'm sure work with these journey spaces have learned. Human elements don't really work so well in the spiritual realm, right? Like things that we think about in a human sense don't necessarily always equate when we're talking the spirit world. So, well, I'm thinking, well, how do I seduce a spider, right? So again, thinking in human terminology, I don't even know, I've never even seduced a woman this way, but like I had a tuxedo on and flowers, and like I was playing nice fancy music and like trying to be really romantic to the spider, and the spider's like, no, this isn't working. So I'm like, well, what am I going to do, right? So there became a moment where I came to realize that spiders are connected to this web, right? So how do they know when something's on their web? Somebody plucks the web and there's a vibration. So this whole journey then became about vibration. And it was really fantastic. Once I learned to pluck the web of that and brought the spider over, this whole new world opened up for me, and I was able to explore much deeper into this. So this one I call Cosmic Web Portal number 5, because in my journey, and I can't speak for everybody, but in my journey space, this was sort of the guardian of the gate to allow us to travel to the next area. The two characters on the side there are kind of the trickster figures who are like, the way I felt it at the time was these are sort of the old school figures that are really familiar. They're kind of hanging out at the bus station or the gas station, or the train station, and they know the area. They've traveled quite a bit. But here I am in this little like balloon, right? That's like a Tibetan symbol for compassion. just kind of like nonchalant and unknowing and have no idea what I'm about to do. And these guys are looking at me like, what is this guy up to? Right? And kind of like that was kind of the sensation, you know, totally oblivious to the intensity of the place, but at the same time, coming in with the compassion, and I think the characters in the place really helped in that manner. So what can plant teachers tell us, especially if we come in with respect, and you know, and these spirit teachers tell us as we come in respect and appreciation for what they're giving. But this led to the next painting, which this gentleman over here is very familiar with because it fell on his head. So this is called Weaving Vibration. So at the second part of this spider journey, what ended up happening was I had a booster. I was a little bit worried about the booster because the experience itself was very subtle, and I was worried if I had a booster and increased the dosage, that it would blow away the spider and I'd totally lose the web altogether. So I was a little bit unsure, but I figured, okay, well, there's a half an hour before this experience, this second booster is going to kick in, so maybe I can really just work into it, right? So I came back to my sleeping bag, laid down, and all of a sudden the cord got wrapped around my neck, right? So here I am, like this cord wrapped around me, so I'm trying to get that off, and as I take the cord off, I put it between my fingers like this, and I start plucking the strings, right? Starting to get back into that vibrational quality, the thing that I was learning from the spider in the previous slide. What ended up happening was as I was plucking the strings, the vibration created worlds on either side of the string. So if there's a vibration above and a vibration below, I was able to look within that world and try and sort of almost like project into that place in almost like a horizontal way. The teacher I was working with at the time works a lot with all different types of music, not just traditional music. One particular type he was working with in this experience was music by Steve Roach. Does anyone know who that is? Steve Roach. So Steve Roach, great, but not great at the same time. Great music, but really hard to travel with because like there's very little beat and it goes really long. So you horizontalize a lot, and it's just like really easy way to travel, but it really breaks you down really quickly because there's no beat for you to set yourself on. So what ended up happening was with this really horizontal sound, I was able to really get in and project into each of those layers of vibration. And I noticed as I changed the vibration, the different qualities, the worlds would change. And if I wasn't able to pluck it right, the world would be garbled. So to me, this just shows that, you know, and again, I'm here talking as an artist and as an academic, so don't quote me on any of this, right? So what this means here is that as the different vibrations come, you're able actually to like look into different worlds, and these vibrations are deeply connected to ourself, to healing, etc. I was on a retreat just a couple weekends ago, which was fantastic, and we actually set up a whole sound vibration healing ceremony, and just to hear the different ways that the sounds enter our bodies, from, you know, the didgeridoo to the bowls, the crystal bowls, etc., and the different elements that these vibrations have and how they react to or how they work with us. So the next painting, this is called Awareness Floating Through into Infinity. So here I am again on a balloon. I don't know why balloons keep showing up. It's kind of interesting to me. I think maybe for me balloons are like kind of like to show sort of the silliness of like here we are trying to travel through infinity and we're using a balloon to do it. Like it just doesn't, you know, here we are also in this Western world where we think we have to have all this technology to get far out there, and here I am in my brain going to these places with just a balloon, right? But here on the one side you have sort of the snake skin, the honeycombs, the veil, you know, and the Shipido, I'm not a Shipido artist by any means, but the Shipido would call it the Ronin, the snake, the great serpent, the cosmic serpent, where all the different designs of the world are in the snake skin. The actual balloons themselves, those relate to an experience that I have about nausea. So if anyone here that's taken ayahuasca is familiar with sort of this nauseous aspect, this purging, this getting sort of clean. What I found over much work, you know, this is I'm only speaking from my own perspective, but that this nausea creates a turbulence, an energy, right? And so when you're trying to move through a space and you don't have a body or muscles or anything to move with, how do you move, right? I need to get over there, but there's nothing but awareness for me to move with, so what am I going to do? What I found through a lot of this work, for myself at least, was that, you know, it can be emotions, it can be, you know, nausea, it can be many different things, but this nausea creates this sort of energy source. And if you can use that energy source as sort of like a booster, it can push you off into further areas. And I'm not saying don't purge, because purging is a really important part of the journey, but I'm saying that if you are just like having, because I know some people have had experiences where they're nauseous the whole night, nothing happens, they don't know what to do with the nauseous energy. So maybe one thing to think about is figure out a way to work with the energy so that it can help you move from place to place. So this here If you were in the April conference, you saw this or heard about this experience right here. This is called blowing bubbles. A couple different parts of this. In case you've heard the story, I'll just go into the basics. This lady had a journey, in case you haven't heard, I was working on this big research project. One of the things I was interested in the research project was on insights. When people are coming up with insights, what do these insights relate to? Are they coming from, again, where is this narrative coming from a higher self, from someplace else? But as I'm like writing down all these insights, and they're all looking pretty accurate, this one lady says, you know, I came to realize there was no Big Bang at all. It was just an alien blowing bubbles, and all the planets were formed this way. So, not so much for my insights. I don't know how I'm going to work with this material, right? But as is always the case with this type of work, 4 days later I came across a research article, and it turns out that one of the ways that protoplanets are formed is from filaments coming off the alien or the sun, breaking off into bubbles, floating into space, and becoming the seeds for protoplanets. So even though she didn't have, you know, the terminology for the scientific way that things happen, she was kind of right on as far as this like sort of metaphorical imagery. What's really interesting to me too about this painting is, you know, even though it's her imagery I'm working with, I was able to put a lot of my symbols in there. So obviously around the black hole there's a lot of music notes relating to the vibration. You have this sort of Ganesh character there, which has come up in many of my journeys. Actually, my second journey ever, I didn't even know who Ganesh was, and this elephant kept showing up, kept showing up, kept showing up, and someone was like, yeah, that's the remover of obstacles, or the placer of obstacles, depending on what you need, right? So I really started getting involved with what that energy was all about. And obviously you have the DMT molecule is what the alien's blowing through there. But for me, the most interesting little part is right there in the third eye area of the alien. This is, unfortunately you can't see it here, but there's a fractal pattern called the Koch snowflake. And what it is, it's a finite circumference with an infinite area. So what ended up happening, it only stays that big, but it's a triangle, and every third is another triangle, and every third is another triangle, and every third is another triangle, so you'll never get to the bottom. From a journey perspective, this is great because what happens is if you need to travel down to where there's a lot of information, this thing, for me, would spin, and I was able to get sort of lost into the infinite depths of what this fractal snowflake was. And in the meantime, I'm going through layers and layers and layers of death and centipedes and, you know, worms and skulls and like pretty dreary stuff. But as, you know, Frank was mentioning earlier, sometimes you have to find yourself into these shadow places in order to find information. As he was saying, you know, he had a picture of the doorway with the big character on there that was really like fearful, and you know, you didn't really want to go in there. But sometimes those characters are only just there to make sure that you're ready for the information. You know, if you're not able to face your fears, then perhaps the information isn't ready for you either. So this is one thing. So I think fractal patterns are really great. When you start seeing fractals, explore the fractals, kind of get into them, see what they can do for you, see how they move, and that might be able to take you places as well on your journey. So next one here, this one actually I just finished really recently. And I'd be really interested to do a chronology of all my paintings and see how they have grown or changed or what have you. This one here I call Plant Teachers. It's not really so much specific to any particular plant. You just see there's some flowers in a vase there, basically just kind of like houseplants, you know, not really referring to any particular type of entheogen. But I think that's important to realize is that, you know, these plants have been growing on this planet for a really long time, and you know, they're deeply connected to what's happening here. And for us as Western scientists to say, oh, well, there's nothing there, there's no wisdom there, is sometimes silly. So that was sort of the initial inspiration for this. The secondary part to this right here is, again, to kind of show sort of this three-dimensional sort of press food type state of like, they're fishing, and then they're right onto the other side. There's a whole other universe just within the fabric of that little area there. And just to realize like that there's worlds all around us right now. And that's sometimes a bit of a head trip to think about, you know, that there's spirits and there's entities and there's dimensions that are all over us right now. And we just, I mean, radio waves and TV waves even are floating through here and we don't really see them. So how do we sort of become aware of that, look into that, take, you know, some sort of lessons from that, or be able to pick up on that receiver, you know. A lot of people say that our brain is just sort of to help us function in this world and not necessarily to help us see all the different things that are around us at all times, but things like ayahuasca, things like peyote, things like salvia, things like DMT, those types of things are able to open up these different places to let us see through the veil. And this here, this is the most recent painting that I've worked on. And this is actually the second version of that painting that I showed earlier that went through the different stages of development. I call this one Deconstructing Spirit, like a thief in the night, because the unfortunate part of all of us doing this work is that it's all illegal. So here we are trying to connect with our divine, and at the same time we're being told by government entities that it's not okay. So that's kind of like the little parenthesis area here. Hopefully that'll change at some point, because I think it definitely has an effect on people, you know, when you're constantly worried about being arrested for seeking your spiritual pursuits, it's challenging. So this here painting is really great because it's sort of like the ayahuasca lens of the active imagination from Jung. So certain similarities that are between the two. There's still fire in the front place. There's still the angel devil thing on the top there. What's different about this piece is the other piece, there's definitely like an angel and devil perspective. Here, the perspective is more like, these aren't important anymore. You're at a place where morals and good and bad, and it's all kind of foggy now, so we're just going to take these horns and these halos out of the way here because we don't need them. Up in the corner there, we have the plant teachers, the Amanita muscaria, the peyote, the Banisteriopsis capivine, which I don't know if anyone's ever seen the flowers of capivine. It's beautiful, really delicate, little pink and white flowers, fantastic. So that's up in that corner. On the far left side here, that's me kind of floating around the sea of unconsciousness, right? This deep sea, this watery sort of aspect. And then, of course, right next to that, we have that sort of character bowing down to show reverence to this sort of divine spirit within. The middle part is Metatron's cube, which is pretty archetypal in many different people's journeys. They see this cube around. Supposedly, I think it has all the Platonic solids in there. I'm not really a scholar on Metatron's cube at all, but it has come up for me quite a bit, and you don't have to be a scholar to paint it, luckily, but you connect with it deeper. The infinite symbol on the legs, where if you didn't notice, it's kind of like a person meditating there, me, right? And then the legs kind of come together with the hands. So this sort of this connection with infinity, you know, it's always interesting to think, you know, to see this competitive nature in the entheogenic world, but realize, like, wait a second, we're talking about infinity, so, you know, these spaces are so big and there's so much to learn. How is it possible that we could ever be stepping on each other's toes? There's so much to work with, so it's really great in that sense to know that there's always stuff to learn. The characters on the far right there with sort of the frog and the chair and the two other characters there. This relates a little bit to the 5-MeO-DMT, which I haven't really connected with at all, but I've been hearing about it quite a bit, so I think it's something that I'm interested in at some point in time in the future. And also what's interesting to me about that is it begins with a non-dual experience, and then you come, from what I've heard from people, and you come back to what is a dualistic experience. So just kind of like putting my, like, maybe that's my invitation or my asking to the 5-MeO-DMT place. Then we have the snake on the far side here, which comes up quite a bit. Some birds and butterflies and angels and that type of thing. But I think really what's most important about this painting is I really tried to show in some way the vaporization of self, while at the same time the coming back together of all the different, like, multiple dimensions that could be there. So instead of it, you know, like, again, this is this paradox, we're one and we're everything, we're nothing, and we're all at the same time. So as I'm me in the middle of the painting there, and sort of, you know, coming apart at the seams and disappearing into nothingness, it's supported by this huge container of spiritual beings around me. So that's a really great piece. And I plan on doing a lot more pieces like this now, especially because I have about 30 paintings at home, so I can really focus on just like tweaking each painting specifically to make it more involved. And now that I've gone through the initial integration of it, I can add more layers to the thing, so that's really great. So that's it for me. Those are my paintings. I hope you enjoyed. It really was wonderful for me to sit here and be able to talk as an artist and come out of the academic hat for a little bit here. And you know, I really recommend, if anyone's looking for a way to work with their experiences, to really try painting as an option and not really worry about, hey, I'm not a good painter, I'm not a good artist, or whatever. Just do it and see what happens. And you know, who cares if anyone sees it? You know, if you see it and it helps you, then it's worthwhile. So, thank you. Questions? Yes. Oh, hold on. Who's running the microphone?
this question's really that important, but it's just kind of bugging me because I'm more interested in the non-conceptual language, and this is going to be just kind of a technical question. Because I've asked someone that does kind of similar, a little bit similar work, this question, and I think you might have a different answer, so I wanted to ask you.
Okay.
It seemed like you started referring to your work similar to the active imagination. I don't know if that's Jungian. You had Johnson.
Johnson just written a book recently called Inner Work that I was connecting with just because it's more close to what people are doing here. I could have gone into the Jungian, you know, it's kind of a similar thing, you know, invitation dialogue, all that kind of, yeah.
So the question is, do you see that much different from what people call shamanic journeying? Can you talk about any difference and why you kind of, we're talking more about an active imagination approach rather than a shamanic journey approach?
Well, I'm not a shaman by any means, and I think what the difference for me is that I would consider the journey to be the experience itself, and why I call the paintings active imagination. I could have called it integration. You know, it's a way to connect and ground the paintings. By using active imagination, you're purposefully putting yourself back into the journey space, but maybe not necessarily having a shamanic journey. You might be like, oh, I remember this one area. Let me just meditate on that area for a little bit and see what comes through and see what happens. So it's not really like, I mean, I guess it could be considered a journey of sorts, you know, but I have a lot of trouble painting while I'm journeying, and vice versa. I don't really, I mean, I journey when I'm painting, but it's not as intense as like an ayahuasca, deep ayahuasca journey. You know? So I hope that answers the question.
It's more like not a document. It's not a documentation. It's how to deal with the after effect of that journey.
Right, and that's where I was talking about earlier about the entheogenic photography versus the other. So I would consider what I call, and this is the wrong term, entheogenic photography to be more documentation. Like, hey, I went to this place, I want to represent it. Hey, this thing happened, I want to put things to it that I couldn't put on in words, elements, emotions, that type of thing. And so that would be more the documentation. The active imagination, the integration would be like, hey, I'm really working with the experience. I want to look through that lens, meditate on this a little bit, see what emerges from it and what characters emerge. So that would be more the active imagination part of the integration. Okay. Cool.
Somebody.
Your presentation reminds me of one of the concerns that I have, which Aldous Huxley in the early 60s called, in 1961, called the ontological question, and the use of psychedelics to explore this. So in indigenous cultures, there's a belief in the existence of entities in other realms. In our culture, we don't quite have that. We have this sort of intermediate thing of the active imagination, which you've expressed. And you've shown that slide where you showed how the slides, your first slide morphed into this final completed painting where there were what you called entities. Mm-hmm. Now my question is, the ontological question, how do we know that those are entities or not creations of your active imagination?
Sure.
It's a specific question to you, but it's also a general question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is something I actually talked about a little bit in my April talk, which was basically, you know, what types of things can we learn that are going to help us relate to this ontological question? And the first thing for me was insights, you know, and maybe, you know, I was talking with Frank earlier about the narratives, where do the narratives come from? It's kind of the same question, right? But for me, if I find an insight that maybe I had never learned before, never heard from anyone before, and I come out of the experience and I look at it a couple days later and it turns out that the insight is accurate, for me, that's where I'm like, where did this come from? What's going on here? So that's one layer to me. I think, and again, this totally... The caveat I had in the April conference was I was saying that even if you have these insights, maybe it's possible that you saw a movie or read a book or somebody on the street said something and it just came into your subconscious, et cetera, et cetera. So what I went is to like the next level, which is like, well, maybe insights about navigation, because here you're learning on the spot. Here you're like learning how to move through space that you've never been to before. So if we can find techniques that work in this space and move through this space in some weird way, are we proving that the space exists? If we find successful ways to move through it, I don't know the answer to that question, of course, but I mean, I think it's interesting, you know, like how do we sort of gauge which is accurate, which is true, what's more real than real, like, you know, and these sensations come, and it really is amazing because, like, you know, to feel that there's a place that exists outside of the human realm that is more real than the human realm is a really weird sensation, and where does that come from? You know, is it just a phenomenon of consciousness, or what's going on there? So.
Hey, well, just on the idea about imagination as something that is, like whether or not imagination can be something that is tangible and real, my take on it is that if you're having an experience and you're experiencing things, whether it's visual or sensorial or other, what is the difference, whether or not it's a product of your imagination or whether or not it's quote-unquote real? Because, you know, perception is all within our minds anyway. And there have been artists in the past and writers such as William Blake who called it the divine imagination. William Blake was very much respectful for the idea that the imagination itself could be something divine. That yes, it's all in our heads, but that is like the true source of divinity because it's a channel from universal creation. It's the energy that's flowing through the universe and through us.
I think one thing just kind of relates to that a little bit, like, you know, here we are at CIIS, and we're always talking with a Jungian language, and a Jungian lens. So when we talk about imagination, maybe perhaps it's better to say imaginal realms or that type of thing. We're coming from a particular, like, vocabulary here. You know, maybe imagination means different things for different people. Definitely in a Western sense, you usually think of imagination as dreams of fancy, et cetera, et cetera. But like I think in this situation, for me especially, like I look at, like you're saying, and that's again the beauty of being able to talk as an artist today and not as an academic is because maybe I can take those risks and talk about it in more of a real sense. Yeah.
And my other question is that I'm a visual artist as well, and I've had some experiences like under the influence of plant medicines where I've created visual artwork to a very extraordinary result that has surprised me as an artist. And I'm curious that you've experimented with creating artwork while under the influence of these medicines.
So I have experimented, but I have not been very good at it. What usually ends up happening is that the canvas starts to get really far away from me, and then I'm like feel like I'm missing the canvas with the brush. It's really strange. I've tried it a couple times, and so I find myself, and I haven't. Maybe I just haven't found the right combination. Someone told me.
Possibly a product of the medium they're using also. Like if you're just using simple tools like.
That's probably true, yeah, or even just like finger paint or something like that to at least get the imagery through. I totally hear that. Yeah, I'd love to work with that more. It's something that I have tried to work with, but I've always had challenges with this. So usually what I'll try and do is work afterwards or the next day or the next week or whatever. What's also nice about that is it brings you back to the experience. So rather than like halving your experience by creating and journeying at the same time, you were able to really focus on the journey and then work afterwards. So.
I've been reading the Castaneda book, The Art of Dreaming, and he talks about tunnels, which I saw in your painting, and you going down to get information and knowledge regarding other entities and if they're a product of the imagination. He was warned not to be seduced because the knowledge that was being offered to him was a form of manipulation, oftentimes presented by these tunnels, which were living entities they called the organic beings. And there were projections from the organic beings. The projections were scouts, which were real entities. But so he would receive information and forget it until he achieved a certain level of energy, and I wonder if that's what you're doing, is you're getting recollection energy through the process of painting.
Sure, I mean, definitely, absolutely. And I think what's interesting about the tunnels is, you know, a lot of times, you know, you could think of it as a tunnel, but, you know, some people think of it as being swallowed by the snake and going through the middle of the snake, or those types of things. So lots of different explanations for what tunnels are. I think Frank made an interesting point earlier where he was talking about sort of like, I don't interview my characters, but to have that sort of like, you know, rather than sort of force or so allow yourself to be open to manipulation, but sort of have that dialogue and see, like, you know, and of course these characters are going to tell you whatever and they're trickster and that kind of thing. But I think knowing that, I mean, this is, you assuming entities are real, right? They have this trickster quality to them, and they're always trying to sort of, I mean, you have to be able to laugh at yourself a little bit too, and sometimes if you have to go down the wrong path, that's okay, because you can always go back and find another way, so it's something to be aware of, definitely,
You're quite an explorer.
I'm learning, so little by little, right? Yeah.
Hi, Larry. Enjoyed your talk. I don't know if you're familiar with the anthropologist Jeremy Narby.
Yes.
And I think one of his books, which is, I think, Serpent Power and DNA and Ayahuasca and so forth.
Cosmic Serpent, maybe?
Yeah, Cosmic Serpent. I think he makes a point that the art that's reflected by the shamans who are artists for centuries portray imagery that is reflecting things or processes that are happening to ourselves on a cellular level. So his point being that for the most part, when people are journeying, they're really refracting their consciousness into their cellular level, and we see it in some of the imagery that has double helixes and little circles, and it seems like it's common to a lot of the art. So just wondering what your thoughts on that
Yeah,
are.
I mean, the archetypes of art, I mean, that's really interesting, and then to see things from like that micro level, to like get inside of what that is, and I think Narby said in the same book that all of our history is in our DNA. There's tons and tons of years of history, so to actually access that, get to it, and find that language, and translate that language, which means you have to be there in order to translate it. So that's a really interesting area. I don't know too much about it from a DNA perspective, but I definitely know that there are archetypes, and I see DNA helixes quite often in my journeys as well. So why are they there, and are they connected to the snake? And that's, I think that, I personally think, although I appreciate his point of view, I think that the DNA and the snakes are maybe two different, sort of similar ideas. I think there's definitely a snake energy, and there's something different in the DNA energy, but that's just my perspective. You in the front row.
So you talked about the plant teachers helping us behind the veil. I guess my question is, why entheogens, or can we look behind the veil without the entheogens, or does sometimes looking behind the veil make us less, maybe, because in our sober day-to-day state, we're not really accessing those realms, and so can it be both beneficial and not beneficial to look behind the veil?
So what I would say to that is, there's a terminology we use here at school, which is called spiritual bypassing, right? You're constantly looking behind the veil or whatever it is. You're constantly looking for that next experience without that grounding. And so to the disadvantaged side, if you're constantly going behind the veil without understanding, appreciating, grounding, respecting what's going on there, then you could probably get lost. An interesting question somebody asked in a class the other day was like, well, can't we just, when are we going to just get past using plants or whatever? And I think that was kind of a funny question, because we've been evolving on this planet, as Indigo was saying, with cannabis and other plants since the beginning of time, and we have this sort of symbiotic relationship with the plants. So it's like saying, when are we going to be able to stop talking to our grandparents? It's like, well, why? I can totally understand. Like, his idea was like, when are we going to be able to learn the lessons to not need these things to keep going? But that doesn't mean that we can't have dialogues here and there, and that, of course, it's illegal, so no one do this because of me. But I think, by being able to explore these places and looking deeper into the places, you're able to find lessons, learnings, teachings, healings, that type of thing. And even if it's one healing over the course of your life, and it takes you 100 times to get that one healing, and that one healing is really powerful and transformational, wow, go for it, Anyone else?
I just had two comments. Sure. When you were mentioning Carlos Castaneda, I wanted to point out that was an example of one of the problems we face in this field, because there's a kind of uncritical acceptance of a lot of stuff that goes on in this field. And Carlos is one of the great examples. I mean, those books excited many millions of people to look into all of these realms. But they've also been, I think, fairly thoroughly exposed as total piece of fraud. You know, he made all that stuff up completely in the UCLA library. That's one thing.
I did hear there were some notes in Harvard of actual conversations, but that's a whole other. I mean, I haven't seen the notes.
Oh, anybody that wants to follow that up, Richard DeMille at UC Santa Barbara wrote, I think, 3 books exposing the, found out that on days that Carlos claimed he was in the Mexican desert talking to this Yaqui Indian shaman, he was actually in the library at UCLA copying passages from books in comparative mysticism, like Evelyn Underhill's books on Tibetan mysticism, that Carlos was practically plagiarizing whole pages of interactions. And the UCLA anthropology department was very embarrassed by this, but it's kind of, it's a chapter that...
He should have painted. So yeah, so I mean, that's what, I mean, again, I can read a fictional book and maybe there's some lesson in there that I get out of it and that's advantageous, and I'm not here to say one person's a fraud or not a fraud or what have you, but I am here to say that, through personal journey, through inner work, that type of thing, some of these things open up, and whether they're connected to tradition or whether they're just connected to your tradition or your personal self, I think that's okay.
Far out. Thank you very much, Larry. Very important disclaimer. I hope everybody here understands that this is an entirely theoretical discussion, and none of us ever does anything like that.
No drugs.
And here is your present from ERIE for presenting. Thank you so much. So there will be a 15-minute break, and then we will be hearing from Veronica Hernandez next.